Hello everybody, and welcome to my video lecture on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Now, the easiest way to understand what's going on in this lecture is for you to open up the PowerPoint slideshow that corresponds with the book and by its virtue of corresponding with the book, corresponds with this lecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause a little bit, and you should hit the pause button and then go into the Jane Eyre folder, or the Jane Eyre module, whatever you want to call it, in the Georgia View, and open up the PowerPoint slideshow that's titled Charlotte Bronte. And then once you have that opened, you can follow along with that slideshow rather than sitting here listening to me flap my gums and watching me do it as I speak. And I think it will give you a clearer understanding of some of the important points that I need to make about Jane Eyre. So I'm going to pause for a second while you pause the video and go open that slideshow and hit the play button again when you're back. Alright, so I'm assuming now that you have opened the Charlotte Bronte slideshow. So with that in mind, what I want to do is go ahead and follow along with you on that. So I'm going to open it up myself. And of course you can see that the title page has a picture or a painting of Charlotte Bronte. Obviously they didn't have photographs back then. But we're going to go ahead and follow this part by part. So to understand Jane Eyre, you have to understand that Charlotte Bronte's life as a young lady, even as a child to a certain extent, influenced Jane Eyre to a certain extent. Charlotte Bronte was one of the three Bronte sisters. They were all three well-accomplished writers who made an impact in their lifetimes. She was born in Yorkshire, England in 1816. Her father was a very, very strict Anglican clergyman. And you'll notice in Jane Eyre that Jane Eyre's dad was a member of the clergy. And she has a cousin that you'll meet later in the book that also happens to be a member of the clergy, who's going to go off and do some missionary work in India. Just like Charlotte Bronte's father worked with poor people. In fact, that's how Bronte's father met his death, was by... I'm sorry, not Bronte's father. That's how Jane Eyre's father will meet his death, is by working with poor, sick people. Alright, she did go to a boarding school for a little while, but the conditions at the boarding school were very substandard. They would probably not be allowed today. They were so poor. Both of Charlotte's older sisters died in this boarding school, so of course her parents said, hey, we're not going to lose our other two daughters. So they pulled Charlotte and the other sister back, Emily. They pulled Charlotte and Emily back out of the school and homeschooled them. So that's basically how Charlotte Bronte got her learning. But again, the poor conditions in that boarding school will factor into the conditions at Lowood in the novel. All right. Prior to being an author, Charlotte did have jobs as both a teacher and a governess. Guess what kind of jobs Jane Eyre has in this book? So again, there's some biographical or autobiographical elements that end up in this actual story. Charlotte Bronte would marry in 1854 while she was pregnant with her first child in 1855. She caught a case of pneumonia. She died. Some people believe it was a suicide. She could have been cured. She decided she didn't want to live and gave up at that point. So that is the biography of Charlotte Bronte, which does feature in this particular book. All right, so Jane Eyre itself. Jane Eyre published, and you'll see it on the title page of most of your editions of Jane Eyre. She published this book under a male pseudonym of Currer Bell. And the reason for that was that even in 1847, when this book was published, women authors were not taken very seriously. Women authors were considered, silly little women, or not as good authors as men were. So even as late as 1847, there was still that prejudice against the women authors. So the Bronte sisters all published under male pseudonyms. That includes Emily and Anne as well. And all three of these pseudonyms had the last name Bell. And as it turns out, Bell ended up being a family name somewhere in the Bronte family tree. All right. When Jane Eyre was published, it was a hit. Immediately, it was a runaway success. In fact, it was such a success because it was such a brilliantly written book that people started looking for this Currer Bell, and when it became obvious that Currer Bell was a pseudonym, they started looking for who is the true author of this book. And some people were surprised, and some people were not so surprised to find out that it was a woman that was behind this brilliant masterpiece. And so eventually Charlotte Bronte's identity did come to light, and it became clear that she was the author of Jane Eyre. So that's what we need to know about the actual book itself. There was some harsh criticism of the subject matter when it was first published. Some people thought that it was focused too much on desires, particularly unfulfilled desires. A lot of the storyline between Jane and Rochester is the fact that they are in love with each other, yet they cannot fulfill that love. They cannot pursue it for various reasons, which we will discuss in a little bit. So a lot of people thought that that was wrong. Jane is a very opinionated, strong-willed, and outspoken female who defies authority and who challenges authority. Women were not supposed to challenge authority in the 1840s. They were supposed to be humble, meek little ladies that actually said yes, sir, and no, sir, to the men in their lives, whether those men were fathers or those men were husbands or those men were whatever. So a lot of people criticized this book because Jane Eyre would stand up to men. Even when she was right, like Rochester wants to have her as a mistress, and she says, no, I will not go to bed with you unless you marry me. Even that kind of a defiance, even though it's a good Christian defiance, still made Jane a bit of a problematic character for many people at the time. And then, of course, there's some sexuality in the book, very mild by today's standards. I mean, this book is not even close to being 50 Shades of Grey. But the sexuality that was implicit in this book still bothered a lot of people of the time. And they also said that the book was anti-Christian for it, even though it turns out that Jane and Rochester will turn to God in their times of need. It was still considered very unchristian because of the underlying sexuality that was simmering underneath the surface. So that is the reception of the book. All right, so who are the main characters? Jane Eyre, obviously, the title character. She's also the narrator of the book. This book is told through first person. So she starts off as an orphan. She goes to a boarding school because her aunt doesn't like her, and she's happy to get out of her aunt's house. She ends up becoming a teacher, and then, of course, a governess to Rochester. And eventually, because this is a Victorian romance, eventually ends up marrying Rochester. Under some less than ideal circumstances, but she still ends up marrying him. So she's on a quest to find her identity and find her place in this world. And that will come up when we get to the themes. Rochester, of course, is the master of Thornfield Hall. He is extremely wealthy. He really wasn't supposed to inherit Thornfield. His older brother inherited it, but after his older brother died, then the property, because his older brother didn't have any sons, got passed down to Edward Rochester. He is Jane's boss, which makes it very problematic when the two of them fall in love with each other, because bosses are not supposed to fall in love with and marry the help. Sarah Reed is Jane's aunt. She does not like Jane. She prefers her own biological children over Jane. She basically has taken Jane in because she promised her husband that she would take care of the little orphan girl, but she doesn't really take care of her. She abuses her in ways that are pretty horrific. Her three biological children are John, Eliza, and Georgiana. All three of these children are spoiled rotten as kids. They also bully Jane. They don't like Jane, so they bully her, especially John. But when they become adults, they all three have their problems. And especially John, who is the worst of the three. But even Eliza and Georgiana have their own issues as well when they become adults. Mr. Brocklehurst, he is the headmaster at the Lowood School. He fancies himself as a Christian who takes in these orphan little girls and takes care of them. The truth is he's not so Christian. He actually abuses the girls while they are in the school. And this causes all kinds of problems for Jane until Brocklehurst is discovered, and he gets discovered as being abusive when half the girls in the school die. Then they finally take the school away from him. He takes care of his own children beautifully, but he does not take care of his orphan girls very well at all. The saving grace of Lowood School during Brocklehurst's tenure is Miss Temple, Miss Maria Temple. And she is the superintendent. She treats the girls very well. She even goes so far as to clear Jane's name of a falsehood that was brought about by Brocklehurst and Mrs. Reed. And she really is the only thing that keeps Jane going until she decides to get married and leave the school, and then Jane, of course, is lost again. Helen Burns, she's Jane's best friend at the Lowood School. She really teaches Jane some lessons about Christianity and about being Christ-like, if you will, about loving one's enemies even in the face of being abused by them, of thinking that there's a better life after this. So she suffers in this life because her reward will be a much better life in the afterlife. At least that's what she believes. So Helen Burns is kind of the anti-Jane in some ways, but she's also the anti-Brocklehurst in many ways as well. All right, Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. She is a character that has been analyzed to death. She is she's insane, but she also happens to be Rochester's wife. And so he has to take care of her, but he doesn't want anyone to know that he's married to an insane lunatic. So he keeps her locked away in the attic under the care of a caretaker. And this is kept secret from Jane even as she lives in Thornfield Hall. Even though Jane is aware that something's up, she's not aware of the fact that that something that's up happens to be a woman, a flesh and blood woman that lives in the attic and is being hidden from her by her master. Adele Varon, she's the ward of Rochester. It's never really clear why Rochester made her his ward, although it could be because she represents the sin that he committed when he was out sowing his wild oats, if you will. She may possibly be his daughter, even though he denies it. There's evidence to show that she might be. She's the reason that Jane gets hired by Rochester in the first place. Or actually by Rochester's staff. She is brought in to be the governess of Adele. And Adele turns out to be a delightful young lady, even though she's French. Then we got some more minor characters here. Blanche Ingram is the wealthy woman that Rochester courts. Rochester should not be allowed to marry the help, but Blanche is on the same social status that he is, and so he's supposed to be obligated to marry her, even though he's not really in love with her. Richard Mason is Bertha's brother, and he's the one that brings Bertha. Of course, Bertha again is Rochester's wife. He's the one that brings Bertha's existence to light and shows that Rochester cannot marry Jane because he's already a married man. Bertha's caretaker, of course, is named Grace Poole. It's her task not only to take care of Bertha, but also to keep her hidden. St. John Eyre Rivers is going to turn out to be Jane's cousin. He is a missionary who's going to go off to India to work with the poor, and he's not in love with Jane, he's in love with another woman, and yet he won't marry the woman he's in love with because to him, love is not as important as duty to God. And he wants to marry Jane because he thinks that Jane will make a great missionary's wife, even though he's not even remotely in love with her. So there's that problematic issue there. And then we got John Eyre, who is Jane's wealthy uncle. John Eyre is told that Jane is dead. He has no idea that his niece is still alive. He wants to take care of her. He has lots of money to give her. And it's not until he's on his deathbed, essentially, that he realizes that he could give his fortune to Jane after all. And this is going to cause problems with the Rivers family, St. John and his sisters. So those are the main characters in Jane Eyre. And these are the ones you want to watch out for. Now, Jane Eyre is a book that's full of characters. I could not possibly list them all in this slideshow and keep this presentation short. But these are the major players that will have a major impact upon Jane and her life's journey. All right. Now we get to the themes. And the reason I have the themes here is because this is what you're going to write your paper on. You've got five choices here on your instructions. And so I touch on these themes a little bit. I'm not going to write your paper for you, and I'm not going to give you all the answers. But these are the things, as you look at the questions before you read the novel, these might be things to look for. Let's say if you choose certain questions. So if you choose to write about feminist themes, you can start with the fact that Charlotte Bronte had to publish a book under a male pseudonym in the first place, which means that women authors were not held to the same high standards or the same high esteem as male authors were. And it's not until after the book is such a success that Charlotte Bronte's identity is revealed, and she turns out to be a lady. The conditions at Lowood School, which is an all-girls boarding school, takes care of little girl orphans, are inhumane. They are seriously problematic, and this is a way to keep women down, even as they're girls. And Miss Temple is the superintendent of Lowood School, and she's kind, and she does take care of the girls. I mean, she is really the saving grace of that school, while Brocklehurst owns it. However, because she's a woman, she still can't stand up to him. She still can't combat him like she wants to. She still, as a woman, must know her place. And so she has to actually resist Brocklehurst subversively instead of coming right out and resisting him. Career choices for women were not very plentiful during this time. Basically, if you were a woman, a middle-class woman, or a lower-class woman, you could become a teacher, or you could work as a servant in a richer person's home, such as a governess like Jane is, or such as a maid, or such as a caretaker or something like that. Now, if you were really low class, you ended up working in factories during this time. And some women, when they had nothing else to turn to, would end up turning to prostitution. That is not something that occurs in this book, though. So the careers for women that are actually approached in this book are the careers of being either a teacher or a governess or some maid or some sort of a servant to other families. All right. So really, the only way for a woman to climb the social ladder during this time is to marry well. And so if Jane can convince Rochester to marry her, that's going to raise her social status immediately. In fact, it's going to raise it quite a lot. And this is before Uncle John comes into the picture. So really, a lot of people are resistant to Rochester marrying Jane because she would have her social status raised when there are plenty of other single women, such as Blanche, who Rochester could choose to marry from. So women could not go from rags to riches unless they married a rich man. All right. Then we got Bertha Mason's insanity. Entire books have been written about this. The most famous, of course, being a book called Mad Woman in the Attic. But how much of her insanity is brought about by the fact that she's being repressed by Rochester? Some of it we're going to find out is natural insanity, which he didn't know about until after he got tricked into marrying her. But the way he treats her probably makes her insanity that much worse. And she has to resist in any way she can, which is to cause all kinds of chaos. And then there's the differences between a wife and a mistress. And will Jane become Rochester's mistress or his wife? Rochester would be perfectly happy to have Jane as a mistress. She says no, absolutely not. She will not sleep with him out of wedlock. So she has to become a wife, and Rochester has to make a choice. Does he love Jane enough to make an honest woman out of her, or does he just want her as a little plaything? And basically that's what it was. Men during this time were allowed to marry and yet play around outside the marriage. Women were not allowed to do that, but men were allowed to marry, say, for social status, or marry for money, or marry for advantage. Yet if they weren't in love with the wife, then the men could then go out and find a mistress that he could fall in love with, or he could sow his wild oats like Rochester does, prior to the book happening. So there's that whole double standard, but there's also that whole, does a woman want to be a mistress to be with a guy she's in love with, or does she determine to marry him? So those are some of the feminist themes. Another major theme that plays out in Jane Eyre is social class struggle. And Jane does not really have much of a social class. She's kind of caught in between. She's caught between being dirt poor and being in the middle class, or being very wealthy. As a governess, she interacts a lot with the servants, with the maids and the caretakers around the house. But she also, as a governess, ends up finding herself in a position where she's interacting with very, very wealthy folks. Not just Rochester, but also with Blanche, and also with some of his friends. Yet, because she's not a member of the high social class, she must know her place and be very quiet and stand off against the wall, or be a wallflower or something like that. So really, Jane does not know whether she's supposed to act like a poor person or a rich person, because she's caught in limbo there. All right. Because Jane is a cousin and not part of the immediate family, the Reeds treat her as a lower class citizen. They have no problems reminding her how lucky they are that Mr. Reed took her in before he died, and they have no problems letting her know that the reason she lives in this nice house and the reason that she eats this good food and the reason that she has access to books is because the family is nice enough to allow her to have all of that. They abuse her, but they want to remind her of her place, and the fact that they are the rich family and she's just lucky to be there. Brocklehurst is a rich man. However, he does not invest any of that wealth into a school. He spends money lavishly on his own children, but the girls at the school are starving to death, essentially, and they're getting sick because they're not being well taken care of. And this goes back to Jane with the Reeds as well. The apothecary comes and treats Jane when she gets sick, not the physician. The physician would treat Mrs. Reed's biological children, but Jane doesn't stand up to that. So Brocklehurst, very wealthy man who does not invest any of his wealth in the children. All right, again, we talked about this earlier. Career choices for women were very few. They could teach or they could work as servants in rich families' homes. Once it turns out that Jane has a very wealthy uncle who is going to will his estate to her, her social status changes immediately. Just like that, she goes from being in limbo to being a wealthy woman. Now, her uncle did not inherit his wealth. He actually earned it. So he's kind of what we call new money. But he did earn it fair and square. And because he did, he's able to give that fortune to Jane so that she can immediately rise in social class. All right, now before Jane learns of her inheritance, she and Rochester are in love, but he cannot act upon that love because the masters of the house are not supposed to marry the help, if you will. Masters of the house, it was not unusual for the man of the house to have an affair with one of the staff. In fact, it was, I don't want to go so far as to say it was frequent, but nobody would have given a second thought to Rochester playing around with Jane. But because of their differences in social class, he cannot marry her. And that is a real issue for the time. The beautiful and rich Blanche Ingram is a constant reminder to Jane that Rochester is above her league, if you will. Blanche is also beautiful. She's charming. Rochester's not in love with her, but because she's beautiful and rich, those two things trumps Jane's charms and the ability to attract, to marry him. So Blanche is this constant reminder that Jane needs to know her place and that she's not a rich woman. Now you got Rochester. Will he marry Blanche because of social status, or will he marry Jane out of love? That is a question that's being asked. Once Thornfield Hall is burned down by Bertha, Rochester's social status does not save him from injury, both injury socially and physical injury. So Bertha really burns Rochester down to the ground when she burns Thornfield Hall to the ground. And so it doesn't matter how rich you are, you can still get injured if your house is burned down. Alright, so that's social status. The next theme is going to be Christianity. Christianity is explored in great detail in Jane Eyre. And Jane will find out that her father was a very, very poor clergyman who died when he caught typhus while helping the poor. So here's a man of God out there helping the poor and the sick, and he ends up catching the same disease they have, and he dies from it. So immediately Jane is influenced by the clergy. All right. Now you got Brocklehurst, who presents himself as a pious Christian man, yet the way he treats the orphan girls at Lowood School suggests that he's seriously a hypocrite. He preaches all about taking care of the poor and being a good person, and yet he doesn't really take care of these girls. He actually abuses them, and he's not what I would call a good person. All right. The flip side of that is Helen Burns, who is a fellow student at Lowood and who is Jane's best friend. Helen Burns is a Christ-like figure. While she's being abused unjustly and while she's being punished unjustly, she still smiles and she still loves her enemies. She still loves those that abuse her. Jane, as you'll remember from the early part of the book, is very outspoken. She does not have any bones about telling Mrs. Reed that she's wrong and that she doesn't deserve the unfair treatment that she's getting. But Helen will take that treatment and just forgive and still love those oppressors. And then even in death, while it may seem unfair that a good girl like Helen is going to die, she is okay with it because she believes that her reward for being a good girl on earth will come in the afterlife. And she thinks that the afterlife will be a much better place than Lowood School is. And of course, when you see what the conditions in Lowood School are like, you'll learn that they can't be much worse. So Helen is this beam of Christ-like figure, if you will, in the face of all the turmoil in Jane's life. And she will have an influence on Jane. All right. So Jane, learning from Helen how to forgive, does forgive Mrs. Reed on Mrs. Reed's deathbed, despite the horrible things that Mrs. Reed has done to her. Mrs. Reed, of course, doesn't accept the forgiveness. She doesn't want it. But Jane actually forgives her. Then you got Rochester's moral crisis. He loves Jane, but he's married to Bertha. He's not allowed to get a divorce at this time. Divorces are hard to come by. So does he act upon his love for Jane because he's in love with her? Or does he not act upon that love for Jane because he's a married man and he's not supposed to, in a Christian way, he's not supposed to play around with her? I did say that men generally would play around on their wives if they fell in love with another woman. But that's still not the Christian thing to do. That's still adultery in the eyes of the clergy. That's still adultery in the eyes of God. That's still adultery in the eyes of Christians. So that puts Rochester in a bad spot. Does he do what's socially acceptable? Or does he resist his love for Jane because of the fact that he's a married man? Eliza Reed, she's one of the three Reed children. She has no emotion whatsoever, and we're going to find that Saint John also has no emotion. Eliza will go off to a nunnery and become a Catholic nun. She's not a very emotional person. She doesn't love anybody, but she goes to be a nun because it's more of a duty than it is anything else. And remember that to go and become a Catholic nun in 1847 was also a shock to people in England in 1847 because the Catholics and the Anglicans did not like each other at all. So it doesn't make that much difference today in the year 2016. If anybody wants to become a Catholic nun, go become a Catholic nun. But in 1847, for a girl that's raised in an Anglican home to switch teams and go over and be a Catholic nun, that is also something that people would find alarming during this time. And maybe one of the reasons why some of the critics thought the book was unchristian. In Jane's darkest moments, when she has nowhere else to turn, she does pray to God. And she ends up getting delivered to the family, the Rivers family, with St. John and with his sisters. Of course, it turns out that they're cousins. You have to kind of give Charlotte Bronte a little creative license there. Of all the families in the world she could have run into, they happen to be her cousins. And they also happen to be the cousins who lost their inheritance when Jane got it. Coincidence? Yeah, quite a wild coincidence, but we give Charlotte Bronte that creative license. But in her darkest moment, when she is starving, when people think she's a beggar, when she has nowhere else to turn to, she turns to God, prays to Him, and He delivers her. All right. Now, before meeting Jane, Rochester tries to fill his sad life up through sin by, drinking, partying, sleeping around with any woman that will have him. And he finds out that the voids that are in his life cannot be filled through sin. And so that is a Christian lesson that this book is supposed to teach. Then you got St. John Eyre Rivers and his sisters. They save Jane from certain death when she runs into a moral crisis. Of course, St. John is answering his calling for the church. And of course, some people pronounce it St. John because that's the way it would have been pronounced back then, but we'll just go ahead and say St. John. He feels a duty to the church. He feels a calling to the church. He does not feel that love or emotion should play into life. God has called him to serve. He's going to serve, and he's going to go on a mission into India and serve people there. And so, because he's such a cold, calculating person, he's in love with another woman, but he won't marry her because she won't be a very good missionary's wife. Jane, whom he's not in love with, would make a very good missionary's wife. So he proposes to her repeatedly, even though she denies him, because He's all about appearances. He wants to appear Christian. He wants to appear like a good Christian guy. Now, that's not to say he doesn't have a relationship with God. That's not to say that he doesn't want to do well and treat the people in India well, but that's not his main motivation. His main motivation is appearances, appearing to be a good Christian. All right. Rochester's punishment for his sins represents God's willingness to punish all sinners. Rochester's rich, he's wealthy, he's got high social status, but he did sin, therefore he will be punished. He's got a ward that could be his daughter. He's got an insane wife who burns down his house and injures him. He really feels penitent. So, once he turns to God and gets redeemed a little bit, some of his eyesight will be restored. So, those are some of the Christian themes that appear in Jane Eyre. Then there's defiance of authority. And this is a theme that's established very early on in the book, when Jane is trying to read that bird book, and John comes in and throws it at her head, and she fights back. Little girls are not supposed to fight back against boys that abuse them. Little girls should know their place, especially poor orphan girls should know their place when the abuser happens to be a little boy that is master of the house. So, that resistance gets her a punishment. And she gets locked away in the Red Room, which she thinks is haunted by the ghost of Mr. Reed because Mr. Reed died in that room years earlier. So, her punishment for defying authority is to be locked in what might be a haunted room without food and without being taken care of. Alright, and so of course, just before going to Lowood, Jane lashes out against her aunt. Her punishment for that is that her aunt calls her a liar, and that reputation follows her into Lowood School and will remain with her until Miss Temple is able to clear that reputation. Jane, just like Mrs. Temple, has to subversively resist at the Lowood School. So while other girls are starving, Jane portions out her meals and gives them to the other starving girls so that they can actually have some food. This is against the rules at Lowood, but then she does that. And then again, like I said, Miss Temple clears Jane's name of the liar accusation. Miss Temple should not have done that. Miss Temple should have just accepted Brocklehurst's judgment, but Miss Temple knows that that judgment is a lie. It's based upon a lie told by a really bad woman, so she gets clearance for Jane, and then Jane's reputation improves. All right. Bertha Mason. She is probably the ultimate in defiance of authority. She is locked away in an upstairs room by her husband, and she resists in any way she can, mainly by trying to murder him. She ends up dying in her quest to murder him, although she does cause him some injury. But, there's the question of, is she insane because she's insane, which it turns out she is a little bit insane, but is that insanity made worse by her treatment from her husband? Can a man take a woman who's a little off balance and make her completely insane by treating her poorly? And the argument is that Rochester has done that to Bertha. All right. Jane declares her love for Rochester, even though it's inappropriate to do so. He's the boss, and he's much richer than she is. The help is not supposed to tell the boss, hey, I'm in love with you. That's not supposed to happen. And yet, Jane does so anyway. So that defies social convention. There are legal impediments to Rochester's marriage to Jane, mainly the fact that he's already married. And yet, he tries to marry her anyway while keeping these legal impediments a secret. And if it wasn't for Bertha's brother, he may have gotten away with it. And then Jane gets an inheritance from her uncle. She's supposed to keep all of that. But she decides to share it with her cousins who had gotten jilted out of the inheritance anyway. That's against the rules. So there's defiance of authority. There's defiance of authority throughout Jane Eyre. And a lot of times it gets Jane in hot water. All right. Finding one's true calling. That's what a lot of you are in college to do. A lot of you are trying to find out what is your calling in life. What is it you're supposed to do while you're alive? And Jane has a hard time finding her own calling. And part of that is the fact that she doesn't know what her social status is. She's an orphan, therefore she doesn't know where she's supposed to go from there. All right. So after new management takes over at Lowood and improves the living conditions, Jane does become the top student in her class. This becoming the top student would lead to her becoming a teacher. So the question is her calling being a teacher? Um, and the answer is she's not sure. All right. While Jane becomes a teacher herself, she gets restless after Miss Temple leaves the school to marry. So while she's working for Miss Temple, she's quite content. But once Miss Temple leaves her, now she's having a hard time with it. And so now she's wondering, what is my calling? So she will become a governess. Jane is bothered by the fact that social class status does constrain one's role in society. Poor girls only have a few options. We've talked about that already, to be teachers or to be servants in a rich home. This bothers Jane. Why, in Jane's opinion, should somebody be relegated to a certain job simply because her parents were not rich? Why should people be only allowed to marry a certain group of people because they are born rich? Why should social status determine one's calling in life? Why can't someone just be whomever they are? All right, so that bothers Jane. She's determined to win Rochester over because she loves him enough to want to spend the rest of her life with him. So maybe her calling is to be Rochester's wife. She runs into numerous obstacles, including Rochester himself. But she feels like it's her calling to marry him, it's her destiny to marry him. Therefore, she will do so at just about any cost. All right. Does she have a right to her inheritance, which would change her life drastically if she got it? She feels some guilt for this. That's part of the reason why she gives some of it to the Rivers family. She's been poor. She's been told that she's a second-class citizen her entire life. Now, all of a sudden, she gets this wealth out of nowhere. Does she deserve it? Does she asks that question? Do I deserve this? Should I take this money? There's all kinds of advantages to taking it, but is it her calling to be rich? Of course, there's her dissatisfaction as a teacher. And then, of course, there's St. John answering his calling. He feels like his calling is clearly to serve as a missionary in India. But he makes some bad decisions in trying to answer this calling. So Jane says her calling is not to be a missionary's wife. St. John believes it is, but she says, no, that's not my calling in life. And so that causes all kinds of problems between the two. All right, so that's the calling in life. And then self-identity. How does one identify with oneself? Jane, because she's an orphan who is rejected by her wealthy aunt and cousins, she has no sense of family. It turns out she has family, but she doesn't know about most of them because that information is hidden from her. Secrets is a big theme in this book. Lots and lots of secrets in this book. And one of them is the fact that Jane has a wealthy uncle and has a set of cousins that live out in the wilderness. So she has no sense of family to help her identify. So since she doesn't have that family, she doesn't know how to identify with herself. Part of her self-identity is clearing her name of being a liar once Mrs. Reed levels the accusation against her and Mr. Lowood puts her on display and says, "This, children and adults, is what a liar looks like." And so she has to clear her name. And Miss Temple helps her with that. But she does not want to self-identify as a liar when she knows darn well she's not one. Career changes. She's a teacher. She's a governess. Eventually she's going to end up being the wife of a wealthy man. A lot of times we self-identify with our careers. I self-identify as a teacher. Many of you are trying to self-identify with whatever your major is. So these career changes change her self-identity to a certain extent. Jane is bothered by the fact that her identity is determined by social class that she was born into, and not identity is based on her merits. This is a debate that was going on and probably still to this day goes on. Should one be recognized by the fact that he or she is born rich or poor, or should that person be recognized based upon the merits of intelligence and hard work and being a good person, whatever it is? So Jane has a hard time dealing with the fact that she is identified as being a poor orphan girl. All right. So, of course, again, Miss Reed blocking Jane from knowing about her father's side of the family, especially by telling her that her Uncle John is dead, causes a self-identity crisis. And then Jane, even after she becomes engaged to Rochester, and he starts lavishing gifts upon her the way that most men would their fiancés, because she still self-identifies as a governess and not as a rich woman, she feels very uncomfortable accepting these gifts. Blanche, on the other hand, would have accepted those gifts and asked for more. Jane, on the other hand, is like, no, I have a hard time accepting these because I'm not a rich woman. I am a governess. And she has to understand that she's transitioning at this point into a higher social status and therefore is worthy of the gifts. So those are the themes of Jane Eyre. So I hope that this video and this little slideshow has kind of helped you to get a better understanding of Jane Eyre. I hope that this will also help you with your paper as you try to answer whatever question it is you answer. Feel free to go back to the video and watch it again, or go back to the slideshow, read through it again as you're reading the book. And as you do so, identify these areas that can help you get a higher score on the paper. So that's it. That's the Jane Eyre video, and I hope you enjoy the book as much as I did.